Welcome to the criminal imagination. This is where we begin today, at the edge of what we think we know about goodness and what happens when it falters. I have spent years reading crime fiction not for its corpses or clues, but for its conscience. The thrill for me is not the gunshot, but the silence that follows. The moment an ordinary person realizes they have crossed a line they didn't believe themselves capable of crossing. In this episode of discussing crimes of impulse and opportunity, I am going to try to answer a question. Are we all one bad decision away? I want to linger in that silence. I want to understand how good people, people like us, commit unforgivable acts when circumstance becomes unbearable. Because every great crime novel, whether set in a snowstorm or a suburban kitchen, whispers the same uneasy truth. Morality is not a stable ground. The moral fault line. We are each our own devil, and we make this world our hell. Oscar Wilde. We discuss three novels today: A Simple Plan, The Couple Next Door, and The Girl on the Train. All of these orbit this idea. Each begins in a world that looks like ours: a town, a home, a commuter train. Each features someone who could be us: a husband, a wife, a woman who watches the world pass by. And yet, within pages, each of them slides from normalcy into transgression, not out of evil, not out of hunger for chaos, but out of something far more frightening: logic. I chose these books because they share a haunting hypothesis that the moral divide between the criminal and the law abiding is not a wall, but a hairline crack. Push the wrong pressure point and it splits open. So, in this episode, I will ask, what breaks first, conscience or circumstance? Scott Smith's A Simple Plan opens with the image of quiet terror: a downed plane, a frozen forest, and a duffel bag holding $4.4 million. Hank Mitchell, his brother Jacob, and their friend Lou stumble on it almost by accident. Hank, educated, responsible, a man who believes in mortgages and honesty, decides they will keep it until spring. It's a simple plan. We keep the money and no one knows. But nothing in moral physics is ever simple. When Hank tells himself he's just safeguarding the cash, he's performing what psychologists call situational ethics, a slippery adjustment of moral standards to fit immediate needs. The philosopher Jean Paul Sartre called it bad faith, lying to oneself to avoid the burden of freedom. Hank's spiral begins not when he kills, but when he convinces himself that keeping the money isn't really stealing. Now, as a reader, I felt that slide viscerally. There is no villain here, only pressure and justification. Wayne C. Booth, in the rhetoric of fiction, might say that Smith's implied author refuses to guide our moral response. We aren't told what to think, we are made to inhabit the ambiguity. In doing so, we become Hank's silent accomplices. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. The story makes us complicit before we realize it. And this is why I chose it. Because a simple plan doesn't describe moral breakdown, it induces it. It proves how quickly reason can disguise greed and how civility can coexist with cruelty. Shari Lapena's The Couple Next Door begins with another ordinary scene. dinner at a neighbor's house, a baby monitor crackling softly next door. When the couple returns home, the crib is empty, the baby is gone. Every action that follows is impulsive, terrified, human, but beneath it all lies design. Anne's husband, Marco, has orchestrated the kidnapping himself in a desperate bid to pay off debts. It was supposed to be quick. No one was meant to get hurt, he says. That sentence, no one was meant to get hurt, is perhaps the anthem of moral collapse. It's where ethical theory meets self delusion. In psychology, this is cognitive dissonance, the need to see oneself as good even when the evidence screams otherwise. In philosophy, it is the clash between Kant's categorical imperative, do what is right regardless of consequence, and Nietzsche's will to power, reshape morality to survive. Lapena's clipped clinical prose traps us inside that contradiction. She writes in short, sterile sentences, mimicking how panic narrows thought. It's the sound of moral reasoning shutting down. Booth might call this ethical distance. We aren't granted intimacy with Marco or Anne. We observe them like subjects under glass, which forces us to examine our own judgment instead. When I first read this book, I realized how crime fiction exposes our everyday hypocrisies. The same social performance that makes us appear polite also enables deceit. We lie to protect reputation, not virtue. Suburbia itself becomes an alibi. Paula Hawkins, the girl on the train, turns inward. The crime scene is the mind itself. Rachel Watson, the alcoholic narrator, watches the world through the train window, imagining the perfect lives of others. One night she sees something, an argument, a shadow, a scream, but her memory is fogged by blackout. I have lost control over everything, even the places in my head. Hawkins' choice to tell the story through Rachel's broken perception is a masterclass in Booth's concept of distance between narrator and implied author. The author knows the truth, the narrator does not. The result is a moral labyrinth. As a result, we are forced to reconstruct the crime, and in doing so, we reconstruct Rachel's self. Psychologically, it's a study in Zimbardo's situationism, the idea that behavior is shaped more by context than character. Rachel's disempowerment, her loneliness, her need to witness meaning in others, all conspire to turn her into both detective and suspect. By the time she uncovers the truth that her ex husband Tom is the killer, we realize that the greatest crime was not murder but manipulation, gaslighting as moral erasure. I return to this book often because it demonstrates how unreliability is not a flaw but a mirror. None of us are stable narrators of our own lives. We curate memory, omit guilt, invent coherence. Crime fiction simply turns that into a plot. When I put these novels together, I see not three stories but one long moral experiment. Hank's greed, Marco's panic, Rachel's blindness. They form a triad of ethical failure, temptation, rationalization, and reconstruction. Philosophers like Aristotle would call these cases of akrasia, knowing the good but failing to do it. Psychologists would call them the victory of impulse over principle. Booth would remind us that every narrative choice, every unreliable voice, every withheld judgment is a rhetorical invitation to judge ourselves. And perhaps that's why I chose these particular books, because they make me nervous. They make me look at the small, invisible negotiations we perform every day. The times we justify a lie, overlook a cruelty, pocket something we shouldn't. The line between us and them is not a prison wall, it's a mirror. And every time we read about their crimes, we are rehearsing our own possibilities. So, what breaks first? Conscience or circumstances? I don't have an answer yet. That's why I'm here. To look closely at the moment where good people stop being good and understand the forces that push them. Welcome again to the criminal imagination where the evidence is moral, the subjects are human, and the crime is always ours to interpret. In a simple plan, I remember pausing every few pages, not out of boredom or confusion, but because my hands felt dirty. Scott Smith's novel is that kind of a crime story. It doesn't simply show you corruption, it enlists you in it. You begin by nodding at a reasonable decision, then another, until you realize you have been complicit in a moral descent as steep and as icy as the Minnesota winter in which it's set. It's a simple plan. We keep the money and no one knows. That single line, uttered by Hank Mitchell in the frozen woods beside a crashed plane, contains the entire geometry of the book's tragedy. It sounds logical, almost mathematical in its symmetry. Simple, clean, manageable. But that sentence, like a cracked mirror, hides infinite fractures. The plan is not simple, the money is not clean, and no one ever really knows what they are capable of until conscience meets opportunity. Hank, his brother Jacob, and their friend Lou stumble upon this wreckage. The moral question begins as a whisper. What if no one ever finds out? Hank, who is cautious, who knows the rules of the small town decency, frames it like a problem of logistics, not ethics. He says, we could report it, or we could wait until spring, see if anyone comes looking, and if they don't, it's ours. This is situational ethics, the bending of moral reasoning to suit circumstance. Lawrence Kohlberg, in his Stages of Moral Development, describes this as pre-conventional morality. Actions judged by consequence, not principle. For Hank, the math feels moral. After all, they didn't steal the money, they didn't give it back. This is how self-preservation dresses itself as prudence. The snow outside is white, but every choice stains it a little darker. Hannah Arendt coined the phrase the banality of evil while analyzing Adolf Eichmann, not as a monster but as an obedient bureaucrat who simply followed orders. Smith's genius lies in showing that the same banality can exist in a man who files taxes, loves his wife, and shops at the feed store. Hank is no sociopath. He is us, minus one unbroken rule. He tells himself he is protecting his brother, protecting his family, ensuring a future for his unborn child. The money becomes moral if it's used for love. I'm doing this for Sarah, for our baby. Now, that sentence chilled me more than any gunshot because it's true, at least in his mind. Sartre would call it bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to escape the anxiety of freedom. Instead of confronting the horror of his choices, Hank invents a moral narrative to sanctify them. He is not stealing, he's providing, he isn't killing, he's protecting. This is the philosophy of quiet damnation, not rebellion against morality, but rationalization within it. Once the first lie is spoken, everything else becomes maintenance. Hank's wife, Sarah, quickly becomes the strategist. cold, methodical, almost Machiavellian. When Lou begins to lose control, Sarah suggests a terrible solution. You have got to do it. He's a threat. If he talks, we will all go to prison. The murder that follows is as shocking as it is inevitable. Smith stages it without sensationalism, no cinematic flourish, just the sound of a man trying to keep his life from collapsing. Hank strangles Lou in the barn, his brother Jacob watching in silent horror. That moment exposes what I call the geometry of the simple plan, a triangle of loyalty, fear, and justification. Every side sharpens the other until there is no escape. After the act, Hank's internal narration barely flinches. He doesn't collapse in guilt, he analyzes, calculates, rationalizes. It wasn't hard, he was drunk, barely aware. I felt nothing but relief, he thinks. That line, I felt nothing but relief, is the novel's moral detonation. It's where the rhetoric turns against us. We have watched Hank struggle, reason, convince himself, and now the reasoning has hollowed him out. Here, Booth's theory of the implied author becomes crucial. Smith never condemns Hank outright. He withholds censure, forcing the reader into complicity. Booth wrote in the rhetoric of fiction that narrative ethics emerge not from what an author tells us, but from what they make us feel responsible for. By the time Hank kills, Smith has already recruited us as silent jurors. We understand every step, we might even agree. That that's the weaponized irony, the horror of comprehension. I remember reading that line. I felt nothing but relief and closing the book for a moment. I wanted to reject him, but part of me couldn't. Part of me had followed his logic all the way down. Booth would say the text had performed its moral deduction perfectly. The emotional apex arrives when Hank must kill his own brother, Jacob, kind hearted and childlike, becomes the last remnant of decency in the frozen wasteland. But when guilt breaks him and he threatens to confess, Hank decides the only way to preserve the plan is to end him too. I pulled the trigger and watched him fall into the snow. He looked surprised, almost relieved. There is something obscene in how calm the prose remains. There is no thunder, no epiphany, just a man performing arithmetic with lives. The act is brutal, the language is clinical, and the combination of those two is what makes it devastating. Philosophically, this is the end point of Arendt's banality. Evil executed not in rage but in routine. And it's the perfection of Sartre's bad faith. A man so entangled in his self justification that he calls murder necessity. Smith doesn't give us catharsis, he gives us aftermath. The money, of course, is worthless. The authorities close in, Sarah grows distant, the moral geometry collapses under its own weight. Hank has secured the future only by erasing it. Why does this story disturb me more than any serial killer, thriller, or mob epic? Because a simple plan refuses to offer villains or redemption. It offers recognition. Booth warned that literature's greatest danger is also its greatest gift identification. We see ourselves in characters we ought to abhor. That identification, as he argues, is rhetorical. It shapes our moral emotions without our consent. Smith exploits that mechanism with surgical precision. By presenting every step as rational, by couching every atrocity in the language of necessity, He transforms the reader into a participant. We become part of what Booth calls the ethical environment of the narrative. The murder shocks us not because it's evil, but because it feels momentarily reasonable. I found myself thinking absurdly, could I have done the same? Not because I am greedy, but because I recognize the logic of panic, the small town claustrophobia, the snowstorm of justification. Crime fiction often sells us control, detective solving puzzles, justice restored. A simple plan denies that comfort. There is no detective, no courtroom, no absolution, only the creeping realization that the difference between law abiding citizen and murderer may be one opportunity, one rationalization, one simple plan. Psychologically, Hank's breakdown mirrors Bandura's moral disengagement theory, the gradual numbing of ethical self awareness. Each decision displaces responsibility until conscience freezes over entirely. What begins as self defense ends as self erasure. And philosophically, the novel aligns with Camus' absurdism. Life as a moral void where meaning is constructed then destroyed by our own hands. But Hank lacks Camus' defiance. He doesn't revolt against meaninglessness, he rearranges it into spreadsheets. The question a simple plan leaves behind isn't whether given the same snow, the same silence, the same temptation, we'd be any different. That's the truest crime in Smith's novel. Not the murders, not the theft, but the mirror it leaves behind. For the reader to look into and wonder whose reflection is staring back. When I first turned from a simple plan to Shari Lapena's The Couple Next Door, I felt as though I'd stepped from the howling cold into a pristine air conditioned suburb where nothing outwardly bleeds. Yet the sickness underneath is the same moral decay, just perfumed. Smith's Minnesota snowstorm was honest about its cruelty. Lapina's neighborhood disguises it beneath neat lawns, baby monitors, and polite smiles. Evil here wears deodorant and says thank you. It begins with a dinner party. Anne and Marco County are invited to their neighbor's house next door. The babysitter cancels last minute. Anne, exhausted, insists she shouldn't go. Marco persuades her. We'll take the baby monitor, we'll check on her every hour. What could go wrong? Everything, of course. They return home past 1 in the morning. The front door is ajar. The crib is empty. Their 6-month-old daughter Cora is gone. Lapina wastes no time in collapsing the illusion of order. The novel's very first chapter ends with the primal image of the empty crib, the domestic equivalent of the snow buried plane. Both scenes are moral detonations disguised as accidents. Both tempt the reader with the same thought. This could happen to anyone. Marco's voice when the police arrive is calm and reasonable. Someone must have come in while we were next door. He keeps repeating it as if the repetition might make it true. Anne is shaking, incoherent. She's postpartum, sleep deprived, already half convinced that she's failed her child before the story even begins. I remember reading those early pages with my stomach clenched, not for the missing baby, though that horror is real, but for the social performance playing out around the crime scene. The neighbors speak from behind the curtains. The officers maintain their professional tone. Marco puts an arm around his wife for the cameras. The street lights hum with the sound of judgment. This is where Lapina's setting becomes her weapon. The suburb itself is an experiment in Milgram's obedience and Ash's conformity. Everyone wants to appear decent in a morally watchful environment. Everyone imitates civility when panic sets in. Anne apologizes for crying too much, Marco apologizing for being too defensive. The detective, Rasbach, notes that they keep apologizing for feelings instead of explaining facts. It's etiquette as anesthesia. Booth calls it rhetorical distance. Lapena's clipped third-person focalization offers no warmth, no interior indulgence. She describes actions like surveillance camera. She picks up the blanket, she smells it. It smells of baby powder, she says. The stone feels refrigerated. We aren't invited to empathize, only to observe. And that detachment, that clinical rhythm, becomes a moral mirror. We feel the chill because we are a part of it. It doesn't take long for the mask to slip. The detective discovers that there was no forced entry. The Countess's backdoor lock is faulty, something Marco had promised to fix. When Rasbach asks about it, Marco's voice tightens. It wasn't that bad. Anne starts to unravel. Her breakdown is not glamorized. She describes it in a small domestic humiliations. The unwashed hair, the trembling hands, the brief hallucination that she still hears the baby crying from the monitor. We learn about her postpartum depression. She says, "Sometimes I'm afraid of myself." It's one of the novel's rare first person flashes and it lands like a confession in a confessional with no priest. From a psychological lens, Anne's condition invites empathy, but Lapena uses it as a narrative misdirection. Like Hawkins' girl on the train, we are forced to question the reliability of the traumatized woman. But here the manipulation cuts deeper. Anne's self-doubt becomes everyone else's permission to gaslight her. Her mother-in-law, an aristocratic tyrant, hints that Anne might have harmed the baby herself. Marco tells the police that Anne has been under stress. The audience of neighbors begins its silent trial. The community's morality depends on her guilt. It restores their belief that bad things only happen to the unstable. That is the heart of Lapina's critique, civility as camouflage. The moral panic of suburbia disguises its own complicity by projecting corruption into the vulnerable. Midway through the novel, Marco, our apparently concerned father, confesses to the reader, not yet to Anne, that he orchestrated the kidnapping himself. It was supposed to be quick. No one was meant to get hurt. That line, the justification masquerading as logic, it reveals Kohlberg's pre-conventional morality, the idea that moral reasoning collapses into calculation when self-interest dominates. Marco doesn't see himself as criminal but as a man correcting an imbalance. He needs money. His father-in-law has it. The ransom will be paid and returned. The baby will come home safely, clean, efficient. Except human beings are never efficient. The accomplice he hires, his shady associate Bruce, decides to keep the baby and the money. The plan unravels like cheap silk. As a reader, I felt the same queasy recognition that a simple plan inspired. The difference is temperature. Where Hank's spiral was fevered and bloody, Marco's is polished and sterile. His evil is bureaucratic. He creates spreadsheets of ransom demands, updates fake emails, reassures his wife, and vomits quietly in the bathroom between lies. Lepena's suburban nightmare plays out as a philosophical argument between Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Nietzsche. Kant would insist that morality must be universal, never treat others merely as a means to an end. By that measure, Marco's crime is the ultimate violation. He treats his own child as currency, yet in his mind he is serving a higher duty to family stability, to appearances, to survival in a classist world that humiliates him for marrying above his station. Nietzsche, meanwhile, would smirk from the sidelines. Marco's rationalization echoes the will to power, the belief that moral systems are constructs of the weak and the strong simply reshape them. Marco doesn't see theft as wrong, he sees his father in law's wealth as an affront. He wants to rewrite the hierarchy that has emasculated him. But Nietzsche's beyond good and evil becomes grotesque in a mortgaged suburb. Margot isn't an Ubermensch. He is a man in a polo shirt staging a crime to feel significant. His rebellion is hollow. Lapena leaves us stranded between the two philosophies. No categorical imperative, no heroism in strength, only fear masquerading as reasoning. Aristotle would call it the absence of phronesis, or practical wisdom, the capacity to deliberate rightly about what is good. Everyone in this novel acts without phronesis. Anne from terror, Marco from pride, the father in law from spite. Even the detective, though methodical, seeks closure more than truth. The community performs decency like theatre, terrified that moral chaos might be contagious. Lapena's prose style mirrors this ethical frost. Sentences are short, declarative, bloodless. She wipes her eyes. He looks at her. No one speaks. There is rhythm, but no warmth. I once thought the writing was too simple until I realized that simplicity is the rhetoric. It traps us in what Booth calls the ethical distance of narration. We are not permitted emotional catharsis, we are forced to stay in observation mode, complicit in our detachment. By withholding psychological depth, Lapena denies us the comforting illusion that we understand her characters. Instead, we hover, like the nosy neighbors themselves, collecting details, judging, analyzing, but never intervening. It's a brilliant moral trick. She turns her readers into voyeurs of decency, the very audience her book condemns. When the truth finally surfaces, Marco's scheme exposed, the accomplice dead, the baby recovered, there should be relief, but there isn't. Lapena gives us restoration without redemption. Anne's face when she learns the truth is described as a mask that will never crack again. She kills Marco in the final scene, a sudden eruption of all the restraint that the novel has been compressing. She hits him once, then again. He makes no sound. I closed this book. I remember I had a grim smile. It was not because of the justice, but because the facade finally shattered. The murder feels inevitable, almost ritualistic. Anne's rebellion against the suburbs' demand for politeness. And if a simple plant taught me how quickly conscience dissolves under snow, the couple next door taught me how it suffocates under good manners. It's a different climate but the same disease. Here, morality doesn't collapse in the wilderness, it evaporates in central heating. People destroy each other not out of greed or lust, but because they can't bear to look ugly in the mirror of their community. Every act of deceit is framed as protection, protection of family, of appearance, of calm. And the final irony is that the suburb itself survives. The baby returns, the neighbors gossip, the lawnmowers start again. Civility endures, not because it is moral, but because it is useful. It keeps the system running. That line, it was supposed to be quick and no one was meant to get hurt, I hear not just from Marco, but the entire neighborhood speaking through him. That the chorus of modern crime fiction, the self absorbing whisper of people who still believe themselves good. And maybe that's what terrifies me the most. Not the abduction, not the betrayal, but the realization that evil here doesn't wear a mask. It smiles, it apologizes, it waves to the mailman. Civility, according to me, is the most elegant camouflage of all. When I finished The Couple Next Door, I believed I had seen the worst of moral decay, the quiet rot between suburban civility. Then I met Rachel Watson, the narrator of Paula Hawkins' The Girl on the Train, and realized that sometimes the crime scene isn't a living room or a forest or a missing baby. Sometimes it's the mind. The novel doesn't begin with a dead body. It begins with a woman trying to remember who she is and she cannot. I have lost control over everything, even the places in my head. That line stopped me cold, not because it's poetic, but because it's terrifying. Hawkins doesn't give us an unreliable narrator. She gives us a shattered witness to her own life, a woman exiled from her own memory. Every morning, Rachel takes the 8:04 train from Ashbury to London. She sits in the same seat, looks out the same window, and watches the same row of suburban houses blur past. One of those houses belongs to a couple she has invented a story for. Jess and Jason, she calls them. They are beautiful, in love, everything she's not. Except Jess is actually Megan Hipwell and Jason is her husband, Scott. And within pages, Megan will vanish. Rachel's obsession begins as something almost tender, a drunk woman projecting her lost dreams onto strangers. She's divorced, unemployed, pretending to still have a job so her flatmate won't pity her. Her days are an alcoholic haze of warm gin and train windows. But the night Megan disappears. Rachel thinks she saw something. Someone kissing someone who wasn't Jason. A figure in a red dress disappearing behind a fence, and then she blacks out. When she wakes, there is blood on her hands and no memory of what she did. It's a classic noir setup, an unreliable narrator, a missing woman, but Hawkins uses it for something stranger, a study in moral amnesia. Psychologists would call Rachel's state a mix of de-individuation and learned helplessness, two ideas from Philip Zimbardo's Situationism. De-individuation is what happens when a person's sense of self dissolves under anonymity or shame. Rachel's identity has eroded. She is not Rachel Watson anymore. She is the drunk woman on the train. The train is both literal and symbolic, constant motion with no progress, a ritual of self erasure. Learned helplessness, on the other hand, is the paralysis that comes from repeated failure. Every humiliation reinforces her belief that she is powerless. When she sees a crime, she doesn't trust herself to report it. When she suspects her ex husband Tom of lying, she doubts her own instincts. I am not the sort of person who can help, she tells herself. It's a devastating lie because it's true only as long as she believes it. As I read, I kept asking myself, is Rachel unreliable because she lies or because the world refuses to believe her? Hawkins blurs that boundary so thoroughly that the reader experiences her confusion firsthand. Philosophically, Rachel's story feels like it was written in the shadow of Soren Kierkegaard's despair, the self tone between the ideal and the actual. Kierkegaard called despair the sickness unto death, the condition of not wanting to be oneself yet unable to become another. That's Rachel in every scene. She wants to be the woman she imagines Megan to be, beautiful, desired, whole, but she can't escape her own wreckage. Her drinking isn't hedonism, it's an aesthetic. Her lies are not manipulative, they are protective illusions. It is impossible to resist the comfort of drowning, she says at one point. And then, of course, the cruelest irony. The woman she idolizes, Megan, is every bit as lost. Megan's own chapters reveal an equally fractured self, haunted by the death of a baby years before, restless, reckless, unmoved. Megan cheats, lies, takes lovers not for pleasure but to escape stillness. I can't bear to be alone, she admits. Rachel sees Megan as everything she isn't. The truth is, they are mirrors, two women dissolving under the weight of expectation. One is addicted to alcohol, the other to motion. Both are self erasing. Kierkegaard might say they suffer from despair's two forms, the despair of weakness and the despair of defiance. Both stem from the same wound, the failure to reconcile the self we want to be with the self the world allows. As I went deeper into Rachel's fog, I realized Hawkins was performing a kind of literary trick Booth would have admired. In the rhetoric of fiction, Booth talks about the distance between narrator and implied author, how the moral stance of a story often emerges from what the narrator doesn't understand. Rachel narrates from the inside of confusion. The implied author, though, knows exactly what happened, and so do we eventually, but only by reconstructing the story ourselves. That's the brilliance of Hawkins' moral design. She makes unreliability not a flaw but a pedagogy. Pedagogy. Rachel's fractured memory becomes a test of our ethical patience. We must shift through lies, bias, and blackout to find the truth, performing the very moral act that Rachel herself cannot. I remember the moment I realized Tom, Rachel's ex husband, was the killer. I felt both betrayed and vindicated. Betrayed because I had spent so long distrusting Rachel that I missed the obvious manipulation. Vindicated because finally the fog cleared and I could breathe. When Rachel said, "He told me I was mad, he told me I made it all up," we see gaslighting as narrative structure. Hawkins doesn't just show us abuse, she makes us experience it. We doubt Rachel the way Tom wants her to doubt herself. By the time he tries to kill her, the psychological trap has become unbearable. Here is the complete spoiler. Tom killed Megan. He was having an affair with her. When she became pregnant and threatened to tell his wife Anna, he murdered her in a fit of rage and buried her near the train tracks. And when Rachel finally remembers being there, seeing Megan confronting Tom, the truth isn't just revelation, it's reformation. For the first time, she acts with clarity. In that instant, Rachel transforms from unreliable narrator to moral witness. Her unreliability has been the cost of her trauma. Her recovery of memory is her ethical resurrection. When she kills Tom in self defense, driving a corkscrew into his throat, it feels less like revenge than reclamation. She is no longer lost in her head, she is in command of it. Reading The Girl on the Train after a simple plan at the couple next door felt like completing a moral triptych. If Smith's novel showed how ordinary men corrupt themselves through greed, and Lapena showed how civility conceals predation, Hawkins shows what happens when evil colonizes perception itself. Hank kills to preserve a lie. Margot deceives to maintain appearances. Tom manipulates reality to erase accountability. And in each case, the narrative rhetoric, the moral architecture, forces the reader to participate. Smith makes us accomplices. Lapena makes us warriors. Hawkins makes us detectives of truth within distortion. This is the rhetoric of sympathy, the way fiction trains our moral imagination. By mistrusting Rachel, by learning to listen beyond her unreliability, we are taught to resist moral laziness in real life, to seek truth even when it's wrapped in contradiction. When I finished the book, I found myself staring at my own reflection in a dark window. For a moment, I could almost see what Rachel must have seen: the blur of faces, the stories we invent about them, the lives we pretend are intact. Maybe that's why this novel unsettled me more than any straightforward murder mystery. It suggested that the real crime isn't killing of Megan Hipwell, it's the way we erase people, drunks, women, the broken, the inconvenient, by refusing to believe them. You are drunk, Rachel, you imagined it. This line is repeated throughout the book. It is the indictment of every society that mistakes perception for truth and silence for peace. And in that sense, The Girl on the Train isn't just a story about a murderer. It's a story about how truth itself gets murdered, quietly, politely, and every day. When I think of Rachel now, I don't see a victim. She's a witness, a flawed, trembling, often mistaken witness, but one who finally forced the world to listen. Now, by the time I reached the end of these three novels, I realized they were less stories than stress tests. Each puts an ordinary person under extraordinary moral pressure and then waits, not to see whether they will survive, but to see when the fault line cracks. In crime fiction, the moment of choice is rarely spectacular. It's quiet, intimate, domestic. A flicker of thought that tips a life from ordinary into irreversible. Let's start with that symmetry. Hank hides the money, Anne hides the secret, Rachel hides from herself. Each act of concealment feels small at first, justified, even merciful, but together they form a pattern that says something chilling about human morality. That we break ourselves not by what we do once, but what we chose to keep hidden afterward. When Hank Mitchell hides the money in a simple plan, he tells himself it's temporary. Anne in the couple next door hides a different kind of treasure: her knowledge of the kidnapping, her husband's guilt, her own mental fracture. Rachel in The Girl on the Train doesn't hide an object or a fact, but an entire truth about herself. She hides from her own memory, from her drinking, from the unbearable realization that she is not who she pretends to be. Three concealments, one trajectory. Each life begins as protection and ends as transformation. Acrasia. the failure to do the good we know. Not ignorance, not evil, but weakness. The will that knows better and still falters. Each protagonist faces a different kind of a pressure cooker. For Hank, it's environmental, the isolation of the snow, the silence of the wood, the heavy moral air of his brother's simple trust. Anne's pressure is social, the judgmental eyes of her neighborhood, her suffocating mother in law, the fear of public humiliation. Rachel's pressure is psychological. Her mind is the crime scene. The pressure comes from within, from memories she can't verify, from a voice that keeps insisting, you are unreliable, you are broken. Three environments, three temperatures all lead to the same result, moral combustion. And when the mind begins to heat, it finds ways to cool itself. It's sometimes called moral disengagement, the slow numbing of ethical response through language, rationalization, and denial. Every one of these characters speak in moral euphemism, the soft words that anesthetize the conscience. Hank doesn't steal, he keeps. He doesn't murder, he protects. Anne doesn't lie, she waits to tell. Marco doesn't orchestrate a kidnapping, he borrows time. Rachel doesn't ignore a reality, she needs to believe. Each phrasing dilutes the crime. Bandura argued that when people harm others, they often rename the act first. The language becomes Novocaine for the soul. Hank calls his choices simple. Marco calls his crime a plan. Tom tells Rachel, you imagined it. The euphemism moves from words to perception itself. That's what fascinates me about crime fiction. It isn't the violence that hooks us, it's the rhetoric. We don't just watch people kill or lie, we watch them talk themselves into it. At some point, though, each of them glimpses the reflection and flinches. That's the moment of akrasia made visible, the awareness of the good and the failure to reclaim it. All three experience the same realization. Morality isn't an external code, it's a muscle that atrophies from disuse. Aristotle warned us that virtue is habit. Once we justify small wrongs, we rehearse them. Once we stop practicing conscience, we forget how to lift it. Camus once wrote, the realization that life is absurd cannot be an end, but a beginning. It's a line that belongs at the close of these stories because for Hank, Anne, and Rachel, the absurd has already arrived. The collapse of logic, the futility of justification, the loneliness of the aftermath. What matters is what happens next. Hank ends his story hollowed out, the money meaningless, his soul eroded by the math of self defense. Anne ends her in sterile calm, wiping blood from her hands, the suburb already resetting around her. Rachel ends hers by boarding a new train, sober, directionless, but alive. They all stand on the edge of Camus' inside. When meaning shatters, you either surrender or begin again. Crime fiction at its best isn't about who did it, but what remains afterward. The wind over the snow, the hum of the baby monitor, the sound of rails at dusk. Each book closes with motion but no arrival, echoing the truth that moral repair doesn't follow discovery, it begins after it. Cue the wind, cue the rails. When I look at these three stories as one continuous narrative, I see not a triptych of crime but of conscience. Each asks the same question in a different dialect. What does it take to lose yourself completely, and what fragments are left when the illusion breaks? Hank loses himself in logic, and in civility, Rachel in confusion, and yet each one in their final moment glimpses something like awareness, not redemption, but recognition. Maybe that's the gift of the genre. It lets us feel moral panic safely. It lets us witness corruption without consequence. And maybe that's why I keep reading them. Because in a world that tempts us daily to rationalize, fiction reminds us how slippery justification sounds when spoken aloud. So when the music fades, the wind through snow, the rattle of rails, I am left not with judgment, but with an uneasy gratitude. They fell so we could observe. They lied so we could listen. The realization that life is absurd cannot be an end. It's a mirror. And sometimes in that reflection we find the beginnings of our own fragile morality. In the next episode, we move beyond the decision of consequence. If part 1, if this episode traced the moment of fracture, the following part will study the ruin that follows, the echo of the act. Nietzsche warns us one repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil. These stories teach through punishment. And so, the episode 2 or part 2 of this will ask what remains of a conscience once it has confessed. Thank you for listening. This has been The Criminal Imagination. If you like this episode, please subscribe.